So at this moment, we're going to make a quick change into Shavuot. Because there's this famous teaching by a rabbi named Abraham Isaac Cook, and what he teaches that one of the things that makes Judaism extraordinary is its ability to, he says, make the old new and make the new holy. And I really feel that today because what we learn how to do Jewish, it's really not out of nowhere. It's by standing on the shoulders of our ancestors and bringing to today, into contemporary times, the teachings that they brought forward thousands of years ago. And as I said, I feel it this Shavuot, and let me explain to you why. Like, one of the things that I think we all know is that any Jewish community worth its salt will be a very welcoming Jewish community. And the ancient rabbis knew this because they taught that when the Torah was given at Sinai in 1318 BCE, when God gave the Torah, God somehow managed to give the Torah in 70 languages simultaneously. And you just have to understand that in the ancient rabbinic imagination, 70 was like the sum total of everything, which means that when God gave the Torah, God simultaneously managed to speak in the language of every single human being on the planet at the same time, which was God's way of saying that you don't have to know Hebrew to be able to understand the Torah. The Torah and Judaism is not meant to be something esoteric or for only the few. Judaism is meant to be for everyone. And we've known that forever. And we know that today. Or let me give you another example. One of my favorite statistics, so if you've known me for longer than 3 days, you've probably heard me say this statistic, is that in America right now, 14% of all Jewish adults in the United States today, 14% of Jewish adults in the US today were not born Jewish, right? That is the most beautiful statistic in my heart and soul. And even thousands of years ago, right, the ancient rabbis knew that how wonderful it would be to welcome Jews by choice or converts into the Jewish community, because not once, not twice, but multiple times in our ancient texts, we read the following story, which is when the Torah was given at Sinai at this moment of Shavuot, the souls, of course, of all the Jews who were alive then were there. But not just all the Jews who were alive then were at Sinai, but the souls of all the Jews of all time were at Sinai. And the rabbis are very, very clear to point out over and over again, this includes all of the converts to Judaism. They say that so that we would all be sure to understand throughout all time and all space that once someone opts into our community, it is as if they were never not part of our community. Point 2. Point 3. Did you know that when the Israelites left Egypt, it wasn't just the Israelites who left slavery in Egypt. There was this whole other group of people called the Erev Rav, or the mixed multitudes, who were not Jewish. They were not Israelites, but they sort of threw in with the Israelites and said, you know what? We're going with you. And they were the first group of what we now today call Jewish adjacent people who sort of became part of the Israelite people and stood at Sinai with the rest of us. That's what makes up the Jewish community thousands of years ago, and that's what makes up the Jewish community today. So with that in mind, I want to introduce the 3 speakers who are going to be part of our inaugural Sinai Stories. Sinai Stories, I don't want to call it a speaker series. I want to call it, these are the voices from Sinai that we're going to take into our heart and souls this evening. They are simultaneously thousands of years old and very, very contemporary. So we're going to begin with Larry Bogatz, who is someone who was born Jewish and has lived Jewish his whole life. Then Skye Lansburgh is going to speak. She is someone who is raising a Jewish family and part of the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude who came out of Sinai with us and stood at Sinai with us. And then we're going to end with John Foley, who is someone who is a Jew by choice and joined the Jewish people with us many, many, many moons ago. So I'm just going to ask Larry. First, we're going to sing a little bit as Larry walks up. And in between each of the speakers, I'm just going to ask each of you to walk up. I'm not going to introduce you. And then after everyone speaks, we're going to read the 10 Commandments. Because after everyone speaks, I hope we all feel like we all stood at Sinai and we're all going to receive the 10 Commandments together. Without further ado, Larry, if you'll come up and join us.
Shabbat Shalom. When Rabbi Sima called and asked if I would be a speaker for tonight, I immediately said, sure, piece of cake, nothing to it, be glad to. And then I went to work and found out that it's very difficult to squeeze 88 years into less than 5 minutes, which is what I'm allocated. But I'll try. So, as the rabbi says, I was born into Judaism, into a Jewish family, an Orthodox Jewish family, and I was born the first male child in a family that already had 2 female children, which made me the Kadisha, the chosen one to say Kaddish for my parents when they left. So it's a very, very important position. I lived, the word shtetl keeps coming back to my mind. I lived in a very Jewish environment, very Jewish life in my first years. It was Jewish because everyone I knew was Jewish, and I'll say some things about our business and the school that I attended and all of that. Everything was Jewish. I didn't know anybody closely or much of anything about not being Jewish. My father ran a kosher delicatessen in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I spent much of my life in this delicatessen. Also, because my mother was not well for much of my early years, I spent I lived in other places. I didn't have a single home in which I lived on a consistent basis. Somewhere when I was around 6 or 7 years old, the rabbi, who in those days, Rabbi Silver, very prominent East Coast rabbi, whose father was even more prominent, came to my father and asked if he would be willing to have me join a group of young boys with which he is starting a yeshiva. The yeshiva didn't exist. And of course my father said yes. And so I began to, in the first school year, I was one of 10 boys that went to the Yeshiva Academy of Harrisburg, and each year for 6 years we build upon that. The school was organized so that rabbis, that we had 2 of them, and rabbis taught in the first half of the day, and then a woman taught English in the second half, so that we were fully accredited. I was not a good student. I didn't like it very much, but it did give me a background that I continued with, at least from a knowledge standpoint. All of us from the first year left after 6 years of study and went to public school. And for the first time, I began meeting people and spending time with people who were not Jewish. It continued that way, and except that we had 2 additional years of Hebrew school available to us, which of course I attended. When I went to junior high and then high school, graduated from high school, and went to college at Penn State, it began my sort of movement away, certainly from Orthodox Judaism. I had some touches of it at Penn State. I belonged to a Jewish organization that its great claim to fame was that it had an excellent cook, and so I had good food that way. The fraternity was AE Pi, if there are any AE Pies here. There's one. Anyway, so I stayed with Judaism, intimately with Judaism, for all those 12, 13 years. Went off to college, spent my 4 years there. When I left in 1960, I was graduating, getting married the next few days, joining the Navy as a commissioned officer, and moving to California. So that was really the beginning of my transition. I've always known I'm Jewish, but not in the way that I was introduced to it, and not in the way that I feel it now. It was sort of like part of just my identification. For about 30 or 35 years, maybe a little longer, and then I had the great fortune of being introduced to a shul which was perhaps Reform. It didn't have a categorization, but it was Or HaTorah was the name of it. It was a relatively small shul, and the rabbi Mordechai Finley, who himself was a convert, was just one of the most remarkable people I've ever known. And I studied with him for the next 15 years. He took Torah study and brought to it psychology and sociology and history. And I mean, he just made it real at everybody's personal level. And I stayed with it until such time my wife and I moved out here. Then I was fortunate enough to meet this shul, but not immediately. But it has been, I think I'm out of time. It has been a wonderful experience, and I want to thank our rabbis, and I want to thank Joan and Nikki for making my Judaism a practice that I am involved with a great deal. Joan and Nikki with the Down Valley Jewish group. We're fun people. And I'm very glad that I had my background. I'm very proud of being Jewish. I'm very happy to be here now. And thank you very much.
Shabbat Shalom. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to Larry for sharing his story, and thank you to Shira for having me as someone that is not Jewish but living a Jewish-adjacent life. My husband Jake and I met in 2020. We had both grown up in the Valley. We're around the same age, but we didn't know each other as children. We both found ourselves back here during COVID, riding out what felt like it could be a couple of months. We met through a mutual friend, we started dating, and the rest is history. As our relationship started to get serious, Jake shared with me something very meaningful to him. He wanted to raise his family Jewish. Not very religious, but more rooted in Jewish traditions, values, and community. He wanted his future children to have bar and bat mitzvahs and to celebrate Jewish holidays, to feel connected to something bigger than themselves. I wasn't raised religious and never identified as one, so Honestly, my reaction was, okay, sounds good. Which in hindsight was probably the least dramatic way to have a possibly major life conversation. However, from the beginning, I felt incredibly welcomed by the Jewish community here. Even though I had no intention of converting, no one made me feel like an outsider. Then Jake and I got engaged, and things actually became a little bit more complicated. One of Jake's brothers, who is Orthodox, called him to explain that he strongly opposed our marriage. Not because he personally disliked me, but because I was not Jewish. He worried that I would never be truly welcomed into the Jewish community and that our future children would somehow feel like outsiders. I found this incredibly upsetting. We were just coming out of a period in America where we were facing conversations of identity, inclusion, and acceptance. And for the first time in my life, as a privileged white girl from Aspen, Colorado, I felt that I was being judged for something that I had absolutely no control over. I did not choose to not be born Jewish, just like people do not choose the color of their skin. What made it even harder was that Jake's sister was also marrying someone that was Jewish, but because she was the Jewish partner, he didn't have any opposition to that marriage. He believed that their children would unequivocally be Jewish. And that's when I learned that Judaism can be kind of technical pretty quickly. And this brother called multiple times trying to convince Jake not to marry me. And ultimately, him and his family ended up not coming to our wedding. Despite his best efforts, we did get married, and it was the best decision of my life. The year after we got married, I was visiting my mom in Laguna Beach when I realized I had completely missed Passover. I got irrationally mad at Jake because I felt like as the Jewish partner, he should be managing the Jewish calendars and remind me of these things. But I was at that moment, I realized that how much this community and the traditions were starting to become part of my life. I added the Jewish holidays to our shared calendar, so now we will never miss them. And at our 2-year wedding anniversary, we welcomed our daughter, Lucy, who's making a lot of noise tonight. She's now 9 years old. And we're raising her, months, not 9 years, 9 months old, and we're raising her in a Jewish household. And while I still haven't converted, I feel deeply connected to the Jewish life through this community, more than I ever expected. I'm currently taking the Intro to Judaism class with Rabbi Shira. We're celebrating holidays and building a Jewish life that feels rich and meaningful. And something that's really meaningful that has happened is that brother, he's softened. Our relationship has changed, and the tension has slowly given way to acceptance and warmth. And perhaps the best part of that story is the brother who once thought I would never belong called to wish me a happy Mother's Day for the first time a few weeks ago. That fully felt like a full circle moment. So I think the lesson here is that sometimes that differences seem to divide us, but community at its best has the power to do the opposite. I may not be born Jewish, but this community has never made me feel like I stood outside of it. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. And when I wrote this story, that was all I was going to say. And as I was sitting in yoga last night, I was reflecting on this speech and finishing the Intro to Judaism course. And I kept coming back to this question that people asked me early on when I started dating Jake is, are you going to convert? And my response, growing up not religious, was convert from what? Like, I didn't understand this whole concept, converting. And when I raised it in class, someone mentioned to me, maybe you should reframe that instead of saying converting from what, but rather to what. And so this reframing led me to ask myself, why wouldn't I convert? And what is holding me back from that? If being a Jewish is less about what you believe or more of like how you live your life, why is it so hard for me to imagine being Jewish? And the honest answer is fear. I grew up as a white privileged person who has no reason to be discriminated against. But entering into a religion that has been targeted with hatred so much is genuinely frightening. But as I reflected on this, I realized that I don't want fear to be the driving force in my life. We do only live once, and I want to live in line with my values, not my fears. And I definitely want to deepen my connection with this community because it has shown me so much warmth and welcoming So with that in mind, I have decided that I'm actually finally open to conversion. This is hot off the press. My husband does not even know this. So I want to thank Shira, this whole Aspen Jewish community, for being so welcome and making me feel safe, and for giving me the space to share my story and find my tribe.
Hag Shavuot Sameach, everybody. As it's been established by our fearless leader, this is a festival of the first harvest. The wheat's coming in. Actually, it's literally coming in Israel right now. The first fruits are ripening. It's an agricultural holiday because back in the day, Jews used to be agricultural. Less so now. So now there's this whole thing about Mount Sinai, which is beautiful. But I can deeply relate to the Festival of a Harvest because I grew up in Beatty, Kansas. It is the Milo capital of the world. And you can look that up while you're looking up what Milo is. It's the deep rural Midwest. Fields of crops, pastures of cows, tiny towns filled with really good-hearted people, but no Jews. No Jews for hundreds and hundreds of miles. As a matter of fact, between here and there, no Jews. Yet it's there, in what used to be called the Great American Desert, that my Sinai story begins. During my junior year of high school, I applied for a scholarship to the U.S. Naval Academy. And now I need to point out that this was an academic scholarship because I'm about to say something that makes me look really stupid. So the application involved interviews, a physical, and a battery of tests that seemed pretty clear they were trying to figure out if I were gay or not. One actual multiple choice question I still remember is, would you rather repair a diesel engine, march in a military parade, organize a fundraiser, or arrange flowers? Of all four of those, I didn't know which one I really wanted to do, but I knew which one not to answer. And then there was the physical. Before we started the physical, the Navy doctor asked if I were circumcised. And I can't say that I had a super solid idea, a medical description of what a circumcision was. I was from a very young age a religious person. I, as we said, knew my Bible, and I knew that this circumcision thing was a big deal with Jews. I was just a little unclear why this guy was asking me. Did he think I was Jewish? And I was tempted to lie. Didn't realize how quickly I was going to get caught if I had. Since junior high, I had been cautiously and obliquely misleading people about being somehow, in any way possible, however implausible, just a little bit Jewish. So I said, no, I'm not circumcised. And we proceeded. And it was a full physical with surprising and intrusive evaluations that wouldn't be asked of me for another 30 years. So finally, when that was all done, and I think, well, this can't get any more unexpectedly weird for me, he casually looks at me and goes, by the way, you're circumcised. I'm like, well, then why did you ask in the first place? So it turns out, which you probably know, that most American males are circumcised. That just wasn't commonly discussed in the rural Midwest in the 80s, so at least not with me. So, I've done a survey since then, and there's a lot of you who did not know that they were circumcised, because everybody was. But what he should have asked, the question that would have been relevant, is, are you colorblind? Because it turns out if you're colorblind, which I am, and I knew, you can't be a Navy scholar. So, for a practical standpoint, the entire application was a futile endeavor. but from a psycho-spiritual experience, it was profound. Scad-tari, or it was a little bit scarring, but profound. I was now circumcised, and thus a little bit closer to being the Jew that I had already long pretended to be. Now, what did I know from being a Jew? Bubkus, baby. The only thing I knew less about was why. Why did I want to be a Jew? Why did I tell my friends since junior high that I was going to fight for Israel? I told my friends that my grandma was Jewish. I read everything about the Holocaust, everything about Chaim Potok. I was the sole victim of anti-Semitic harassment on my campus. And I wrote papers on Golda Meir and the great Jewish writers of the Pale. But I learned that one cannot will oneself to be a Jew. It cannot merely be words. It's not reading one book or 200 books. And it's not loving pumpernickel bagels, which I do. You got to do the Jew. So finally, while living in Fort Collins, Colorado, I reached out to the local shul to convert. The shul didn't reach back. So I went snowboarding at Copper Mountain and met Jeffrey Mark Grinspoon, my bashert-to-be. Soon we moved to Chicago. We shul shopped. On Shamet Synagogue became my Mount Sinai, where I immediately started the Jew by Choice program. Now, I had not heard of the phrase Jew by choice up to this point. I like how it reminds me that the people born Jewish don't have a choice. I found out that old Jews like to introduce new Jews to other new Jews. Same with gays. So once I was introduced to a new Jew who lived in Israel, which was incredibly intimidating, and I was super jealous. But she told me in a hushed, sort of hurt tone that in Hebrew, convert means stranger, ger. I still, to this day, think of that, and I feel sorry for her and ashamed of any fellow Jew that made her hear that word and feel that word that way. Because that's not the full Hebrew for convert. It's ger tzedek, which means righteous stranger. And if the use of the word stranger still bothers you, remember, and a stranger you shall not wrong or oppress, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So before Sinai, all Jews were strangers, strangers to their homeland, strangers to their identity, and even strangers to their God. Now, I won't bore you with the annoying joy I experienced with everything I learned and how insanely much I loved it, particularly learning how much Larry hated it all. The Jews without choice in Hebrew school, it's not a great story. But I devoured everything Jewish, everything Jewy. My deeply culturally but less halakhically Jewish husband even kept kosher light with me for a year. And then the big day with the mikveh and the Beit Din and the hatafat dam brit, which means drawing of the blood of the covenant. This is the ritual that's performed instead of a brit milah, a bris, if one is lucky enough to have already been milad, which, as you all now know, I was. Jewish ritual, being so deeply ancient, involves more actual blood than other contemporary traditions. So once again, I stood before an imposing authority figure, a chazan in this case, and thank God not ours. I had to again present myself vulnerably while he kibbuthed about the cubs to distract us both. Blood had to be drawn, a white cloth reddened, much like my face, then taken to the next room and presented to the Beit Din, the house of judgment, the rabbis and our chazan, so that I could be declared one of the tribe. This is how I, John Thomas Foley of Beatty, Kansas, finally became a Jew. The drawing of the blood experience was a little awkward, objectively a little ridiculous, and perhaps ultimately deeply one of the most beautiful and meaningful experiences of my life. And while I still don't know why all that time I wanted to be a Jew, I do know that this is why I am a Jew, a people a tradition, a God that takes life that can be and often is awkward and ridiculous and makes it something beautifully meaningful. Through us, our choices, and the doing we do as Jews. And so, Hineni, here I am, a Jew by choice, though I don't know if I really had a choice or whose choice it was, but I know I was meant to be this. Here, me, celebrating with you the spring harvest, the first fruits, and the giving of the Torah that teaches us to make life, despite life, meaningful and beautiful. Shabbat Shalom.